This is a brief video about the difference between Matthias's linkage system for his tenon cutting jig and the linkage system on my bridle joint, box joint tenon cutting jig that I modeled after his. Both of our jigs use a moving carriage on linear rails to move the workpiece against the saw blade. And that carriage is attached to this linkage here, and in my design, this linkage here. And because of that, the linkage and the pivot point are constrained in a single axis to only move horizontally, as you can see. Because the pivot point is fixed here, the primary pivot point for which the movement arm is located has to be able to move in the vertical axis. Otherwise, it just wouldn't move. Matthias handles that vertical movement problem by adding another linkage here and then fixing it to a fixed axis here. But a side effect of his linkage system is that this fixed axis and this linkage create an arc as it moves through its total travel, adding a little bit of horizontal movement to this axis point that we don't want. Now in Matthias's design, it's not a huge deal. For one, his arm is short, and the total horizontal misalignment added is, I think, in the couple of thou range. Not a huge deal. The other reason why it's not a big deal is because he uses a dial indicator attached to the absolute position of his carriage. Therefore, it doesn't really matter if this locating pin becomes off on the template by a couple thou. He always knows exactly how much he's moved his carriage because he can just read it off the dial indicator down to the fraction of a thou. So it's not a huge deal for him. In my design, my carriage has a total of 4.5 inches of movement in a single travel arm path, which means that I really wanted to try to get away from any kind of lateral misalignment between my template and my carriage pin and my axis. So to do that, I added a second linear guide system for this pivot to force it to only move in the vertical axis. It added a bit more complication to the total design, but I think it's worth it because the 4.5 inches is too large for a dial indicator, and I would have to use a caliper instead, and I didn't really want to spend the money on another caliper, and I wanted to be able to make my templates just from measurements. So knowing that there is no lateral misalignment now, I can cut my templates to the exact 3:1 or 2:1 ratios that I know my arm locating pins are at, rather than having to do what Matthias did and mark out the location of each stop he wanted on his template using the dial indicator as his absolute reference, because he has a little bit of misalignment introduced. Both good ways to go about it. I just decided to try to add a little more accuracy to my system.